handful of Final Fantasy dungeons stop being places and become the memory the entire game is built around. Kefka's tower rises out of a world already shattered. Avalanche storms the Shinra building while Midgar watches. Sin's interior sits inside the creature that erased Zanarkand centuries earlier. That's why today I'm ranking the single most iconic dungeon from every mainline Final Fantasy game and explaining what actually earned each one that title, starting with the entry, whose own name might not be real. Drake's Fall. There is no clearly marked Final Fantasy XVI dungeon canonically named Drake's Fall. Search the name anyway, and you land on a repeated pattern: Drake's Head, Drake's Breath, and Drake's Fang, 3 of the game's Mother Crystal sites. That's 3 separate icon battlegrounds fighting over one syllable, and none of the guides apologize for it. Each one carries a different chapter of Clive's war against the crystals that raised him and occasionally tried to kill him. Drake's Head is destroyed during the Crystal's Curse, a main quest in which Clive's party infiltrates the Mother Crystal to destroy it. Drake's Breath sits in the Iron Kingdom, tied to fire and ice, a set piece centered on the Mother Crystal and Jill's confrontation with the Patriarch. Drake's Fang is the one that reads closest to a dungeon, mine shafts winding toward the inner sanctum during Into the Darkness, leading into Clive's confrontation with Hugo, Kupka, and Titan. Nothing in the available record confirms a 4th site called Drake's Fall. Follow the pattern anyway. For a mine-based Drake location, Drake's Fang is the relevant match, mine shafts winding toward the inner sanctum and that Titan confrontation, the closest thing here to a proper crawl through the dark. Final Fantasy XVI launched on PlayStation 5 on June 22, 2023. That date is solid. Drake's Head, Drake's Breath, and Drake's Fang are 3 examples of the game's repeated Drake's naming scheme. A dungeon earns its place in memory by surviving the mix-up, and the next descent turns that same confusion into the whole point of the layout. The Great Crystal. Final Fantasy XII hides one of its most disorienting dungeons behind the most beautiful name in the game, and players routinely get turned around inside it. The pilgrimage promised by that name gets no conventional map past the gate, leaving the area names and waystones to do most of the navigational work. The words read like ancient poetry, but the area names combine terms for direction, distance from the core, and movement between levels without serving as a conventional map. Jeruvigan's ancient city leads straight into the Great Crystal, deep in the story's late-game Akuria arc. Getting there demands serious progress, so the crystal greets you as a reward wrapped in a trap. Many Great Crystal subareas use labels built from terms like A, Da, Udi, Pra, Ava, and Prati, each marking direction or movement through the teleporter network, coordinates dressed as scenery. Stack that onto named tiers like the peak and the core, the dungeon reads like a language exam. Navigation here gets zero help from a conventional minimap. Player discussions and guides recommend drawing a map, using an external map, or following a memorized route. The naming trick that opened this ranking turns into full-level design here, vocabulary doing the work of an actual map. A player chasing the game's grandest crystal ends up chasing syllables instead, paying for that pilgrimage in backtracking and repeated teleports rather than gil or hit points. The naming pattern can be inferred from the area names, and is explained by external maps and reference material. The result is a dungeon whose naming system can feel atmospheric, even as player discussions commonly describe the route as confusing and maze-like. Once the route itself becomes hostile, the scale of the threat can turn the dungeon into a weapon pointed at the whole world. The Giant of Babel. A dungeon housed inside a colossal war machine is already unusual. One transported from the moon to the blue planet through an ancient tower is something else again. The Giant of Babel is easy to mix up with the Tower of Babel, since the games give both structures the same name and connect them to the same plan. The tower is a fixed spire climbed early. The giant is the colossal machine brought forth through the tower. A mobile weapon, redecorating optional, with the mass of a mountain and the intent of a missile. Under Zemus's control, Golbez gathers the crystals needed to bring the giant to the blue planet, and the fortress carries that ambition literally. It arrives on the blue planet through the tower, drawing forces from both the overworld and underworld into the same battle. The party moves through a mechanical interior instead of stone hallways, and by the time the climb ends, they are standing inside the same weapon Golbez, under Zemus's control, helped bring to the blue planet. The Great Crystal buried its intruders in a fixed maze of branching paths, gates, and waystones. The Giant of Babel takes that same hostility and gives it a hull, an engine, and a destination. The 8 crystals Golbez gathers are used at the tower to bring the giant to the blue planet, turning the crystal hunt into a direct threat to the world below. Baron already fell once under this exact kind of pressure, and this ranking reads the giant's arrival as that same bill coming due a second time. Its scale is the clearest reason for this ranking to call it memorable, even if no representative fan poll fixes its broader place. Without a representative poll, the comparison to later villain fortresses has to remain this ranking's judgment rather than a rule about the whole community. Once a location starts acting like a weapon instead of a maze, the question stops being about the road and starts being about who is waiting at the end of it. Pandemonium. A tyrant can die and still keep expanding his empire. Final Fantasy II defeats its emperor before the finale, then sends the party into Castle Palamecia after it has become Pandemonium, the capital of Hell. The rebellion that opens the game reads like straightforward wartime fiction. An empire conquers, resistance forms, soldiers die trying to take a homeland back. Pandemonium breaks that pattern completely. It shows up as the last dungeon and drops the pretense of castles and border forts, trading them for a fortress named after the literal capital of Hell. Milton coined the name Pandemonium for the capital of Satan and his demonic peers, and Final Fantasy II borrows the word for its infernal final dungeon, stocked with monsters that have no business in a border dispute between 2 human armies. Pandemonium is a long, dangerous final dungeon with powerful enemies wading through the route. Enemies hit hard, the road is long, and the game's use-based progression tracks what characters practice in battle instead of relying on one conventional character level, so a party can reach the finale underprepared in specific abilities and turn every hallway into a gamble. Its difficulty has generated strong reactions, but there is no basis for calling the player response an even split. The Rebellion's fighters initially face what looks like an earthly enemy, the Palametian Empire and its army. Pandemonium reveals the fight was actually aimed at something that outlasted its emperor. Nothing in the script spells this out directly, but the emperor's power survives his death. He returns from Hell as its ruler, and Castle Palamecia becomes Pandemonium, the capital of Hell, a hostile stronghold occupied by powerful monsters. The Giant of Babel proved a dungeon could become a weapon large enough to threaten a world. Pandemonium proves that weapon can keep firing after the hand holding it is gone. An infernal stronghold gives the finale a place to stand, while the next descent removes the ground beneath reality itself. Interdimensional Rift. By the time Exdeath drags the party into this place, the game has stopped bothering to give them a floor plan. That's the joke buried in Final Fantasy V's last dungeon. Earlier, the party storms Castle Exdeath, a conventional castle with a throne room. The Interdimensional Rift replaces that kind of single location layout with a sequence of areas that resemble places seen earlier in the game. This is the space between dimensions, where the void was sealed between 2 worlds. Exdeath tears that seal open by reuniting the worlds so he can seize the void's destructive power. Walk through it, and the scenery refuses to agree with itself. One stretch strongly resembles an earlier location the party has already cleared, folded into the rift without the game explaining every visual connection. The environments shift between disconnected, surreal zones, all inside the space where the void was sealed and where Exdeath seeks to claim its power. He wants to control the force that unmakes reality, and the rift is where that pursuit plays out. Compare that to the fortress the party stormed one arc earlier, built with actual walls and a throne room, run by a villain who still respected architecture. Nothing in Final Fantasy V states it outright, but follow the pattern. The stitched-together zones make this final approach feel less like clearing a dungeon and more like watching the universe come apart around you. Tucked inside this nightmare are 2 of the game's most brutal optional fights. Omega is an optional superboss with no role in the required route, sitting there for anyone willing to go looking for it. Nothing in the game explains why it's there, but the fight plays like a pure test of whether the party can survive something brutal. Shinryu is worse, an optional dragon hiding inside a treasure chest in the Rift's inner sanctum. Neither one needs to be fought. Both got fought anyway by players who decided a broken dimension wasn't dangerous enough on its own. The party's journey across the 2 worlds and their eventual reunification lead to this moment. The rift is the shape Exdeath's ambition takes once nothing holds reality together, the architecture of a man who wanted power over unmaking and got a home made from it instead. Reality can fracture around a villain, and the next fortress makes that same fracture feel personal. Ultimecia Castle. Final Fantasy VIII builds its combat around a heavily customizable junction system, then seals most of your battle commands the second you reach the final dungeon. Ultimecia Castle sits at the end of that last stretch, the final dungeon and the route to the sorceress herself. The party reaches her domain during the endgame assault, and the castle becomes the route to the final confrontation, standing between them and a woman trying to compress all of time into a single moment. The castle leaves your junction setup intact, sealing most of the party's battle commands the instant you cross the threshold. It answers a carefully built loadout by locking many of those commands in a drawer. Recovery comes one fight at a time. Beat a boss, get a function back. The layout branches enough that you choose which piece to earn first: magic, GF as commands, whatever you're missing most. Fans still argue whether that's a clever final exam or an irritating interruption to hours of setup, though plenty of players praise the atmosphere even while debating the mechanics, a corridor of gothic, decaying architecture that looks exactly like what it is. The interdimensional rift turned a crumbling world into someone else's problem to survive. This castle turns that same collapse inward, handing the unraveling straight to the player's own toolkit. Squall walks in heavily restricted, and the castle invites him to rebuild his toolkit before the final battle. Once a dungeon can dismantle the player's confidence from inside the rules, the next landmark shifts that pressure into a building where every floor exposes the machinery of power. The Shinra Building. The scariest floor in Final Fantasy VII has an elevator, a lobby desk, and security guards who treat every unannounced visitor like a paperwork problem. 70 stories of corporate offices sit at the center of Midgar's political and economic power, and Square Enix turns the building into a dungeon built from the mundane grammar of a corporate office. Ultimicia's castle asked players to survive with power stripped away. The Shinra Building strips away the fantasy setting instead, trading torches and stone for office corridors and elevators, and somehow, that swap makes the oppression underneath the plate land harder. The slums beneath the plate stand in sharp contrast to Shinra's headquarters, making the tower's corporate power feel inseparable from Midgar's class divide. The climb runs vertical and literal. Cloud's party fights through security checkpoints and eventually reaches Hojo's laboratory, where it encounters specimen tanks. After the party is captured and freed, the sequence leads to the upper floors. The party finds President Shinra dead in his office, with Sephiroth's Masamune embedded in his back. The original game does not show the killing directly. The escape that follows sends the party out of Midgar, leaving a city still under Shinra's control and opening the route to the wider world. Because this sequence lands in the middle of the story rather than at the end, wearing none of the traditional final dungeon dressing, its place on a dungeon list is ultimately a matter of ranking and taste. What it earns instead is recognition. The Shinra Building gives Shinra's cruelty a memorable physical setting, with the party climbing through the corporation's floors before escaping Midgar. A building can expose the people behind a system, while a more alien destination will make the system itself feel like a ritual chamber built around one living symbol: Orphan's Cradle. A cradle is supposed to protect something small and defenseless, rocking it until it's ready for the world. This one houses Orphan, the fal'Cie the party ultimately confronts. Orphan's Cradle is Final Fantasy XIII's final dungeon, the last major progression route before the party's confrontation with Orphan. Inside it, the party battles Barthandelus, the fal'Cie waiting in the final room before facing Orphan. The game launched in Japan on December 17, 2009, then in North America and Europe on March 9, 2010. The architecture matches the moment. This late stretch of the game trades Cocoon's earlier fields and cities for its most abstract, technologically alien environments. Floating platforms and geometric shafts, structures that look grown rather than built, machinery designed by something that never had to think in human terms. The name carries double duty, labeling both the ground the party walks on and the entity waiting at the end of it. Crossing the cradle means crossing through a fal'Cie-created space before the party lays eyes on Orphan itself. Lightning's group are LT, humans branded by fal'Cie, and Orphan's Cradle turns that conflict into the final approach. The Shinra Building turned corporate power into something players climbed floor by floor. Orphan's Cradle hands that trick to a belief system instead of a boardroom, framing the approach with cathedral-like imagery rather than corporate imagery. That ceremonial design feeds into a real debate. Some players criticize Final Fantasy XIII's directed progression, while others find Orphan's Cradle visually distinctive. That design can make the final approach feel like a rite the party walks through rather than a path it freely chose. When control takes on the shape of a shrine instead of a skyline, the ground itself starts working like a memory, and the next steps force the party through the history that built them toward this exact ending. Memoria. Final Fantasy IX gives its heroes a staircase built out of everything they have already survived, and the dungeon is called Memoria. The dungeon appears as a portal above the Ifa tree after Terra's destruction. Getting there means the story has already ended Terra, the older planet that spent the game trying to fold Gaia into itself. Walking through it means walking through what that planet remembers about itself. From there, the path leads toward the Crystal World, the next stop before the story's ending. The rooms don't hide the concept. The stairs of time climb without going anywhere physical. Recollection replays fragments the party has already lived. Lost Memory is one of Memoria's named areas, part of a dungeon built around memory-themed spaces. Time Warp bends the route until past and present sit on the same tile. The music carries the same idea in its title, Memoria, rendered elsewhere as Place of Memory, and it plays during the party's visit to Memoria like a single held breath. Orphan's Cradle turned a myth into a room that decided the hero's fate for them. Memoria goes a step further and turns memory itself into the floor plan, so the party is walking toward Kuja through memory-themed spaces. Zidane crosses ground built from Garnet's lost kingdom and his own erased past, and neither one gets to skip a room to avoid it. Several of Memoria's named spaces ask the party to stand inside something they've already lived through, memory turned into ground underfoot. Guides use names such as Stairs of Time and Lost Memory for Memoria's areas, but the evidence does not establish whether Gaia's people would recognize them as in-world place names. The bigger pattern barely needs settling either way. The distinction is not settled by the sources available here. A game that spends a major part of its finale walking players through memory is telling you exactly what its ending is made of. A memory can hold a world together long after the world itself is gone. Somewhere below the next descent, a different question is waiting. Sin's interior, Final Fantasy. 10 spends much of its story building toward one impossible location, the inside of the thing that has been slaughtering Spyra for generations. The party physically walks into Sin's body, room by room, for the game's final approach. The English menu labels the destination Sin, while wikis and walkthroughs generally use Inside Sin for the dungeon itself. Sin's interior works as an informal description of that same ending gauntlet, and that difference in terminology can make the informal name sound more official than it is. By the time Yuna's group reaches this point, the pilgrimage has already cost her companions dearly, though the final summoning's defining price is still ahead of her. A successful pilgrimage traditionally ends with the summoner's death, and every step through Sin's surreal interior spaces is Yuna walking closer to that same fate. Braska paid that price about a decade earlier, and Yuna's mother died before Yuna's pilgrimage began, when Sin attacked her ship. Sin's interior is where his daughter finally settles the family's debt. Memoria turned Zidane's memories into a hallway you could walk down. Sin's interior turns the villain itself into that hallway. The threat and the terrain collapse into the same object. For as long as this dungeon lasts, walking forward means walking through Sin's own structure. The route through inside Sin leads toward Braska's final Aeon, and beyond it, Yu Yevon himself, the architect of a cycle he's been running for 1,000 years, the same cycle in which a successful summoner's final Aeon becomes the basis for the next Sin. Walk far enough through this thing and you reach the machine responsible for building it in the first place. The game's finale is often remembered for its emotional payoff, a physical answer to a story that spent 40 hours asking what Sin actually is. Inside Sin's design turns abstract in its later rooms, trading solid geography for something closer to a fever state. That same abstraction can be read as reinforcing the catastrophe's unnatural scale. A disaster this old and this world-shaping resists clean architecture by nature, and putting the player inside its body is the most direct version of that idea available. Final Fantasy X first released in Japan on July 19, 2001, and gave players a final dungeon inside the game's central threat, rendered as a surreal interior rather than a conventional place. A world-sized wound can become a room the heroes enter, and the highest rung will reveal the place where the journey first began, waiting at its own ending. Insomnia. Noctis leaves Insomnia at the start of the game, then returns to the ruined city only in Chapter 14, and by the time he walks through it, it's already dead. That's the deal Insomnia makes with the player. It's the Crown City, the capital of Lucis, the throne Noctis is born to inherit, and the game opens by shipping him out of it before the story gets started. He crosses the border, the city falls behind him, and the next real look anyone gets at it comes on a mission titled The Cure for Insomnia. By then the capital is rubble, Imperial forces have leveled it, the throne room is a crime scene, and the homecoming the plot built toward plays out as a funeral walk through a place Noctis can no longer live in. The original release keeps that walk short. A handful of streets, several boss fights, then credits. For a location carrying this much weight, in a game that spent its opening hours tearing Noctis from Insomnia's imagined future, the base version of his own capital felt like a eulogy read off an index card. The Royal Edition rewrote that math. New map sections and side quests expand Insomnia, with a Cerberus encounter and an optional Omega fight added for players chasing the hardest content available, while Ifrit remains a story boss from the original Chapter 14. The ruin grew. The morning finally got room to breathe. Nothing in the base release confirms Square Enix meant Insomnia's shortness as a statement, but the limited route remains a recurring point of fan discussion. A hero's home deserved more time than his tutorial got, and the Royal Edition expanded the city so players could spend more time exploring it. A ruined home can carry one hero's grief. What happens when a game's skyline becomes one of the images associated with its ending? The Crystal Tower. Say Crystal Tower to a room full of Final Fantasy fans, and for Final Fantasy XIV players, that name may evoke its Alliance Raid series, but the name comes from Final Fantasy III, the original 1990 family computer game that introduced it. That gap between memory and origin is the whole story here. Final Fantasy III ties its world's balance to 4 elemental crystals, and its 4 orphaned warriors of light begin their journey when the Wind Crystal grants them its power. The Crystal Tower is where that structure gets paid off. It's the ascent toward Zand, a vertical gauntlet whose crystal imagery reflects that same 4-crystal structure. Beat the tower and you've earned the right to face what's actually breaking the world. The Crystal Tower gives Final Fantasy III's endgame a distinct vertical shape, one Final Fantasy XIV would later adapt directly, reusing the tower and several of its bosses for an MMO raid. It's an early memorable version of the series' endgame ascent. The party climbs toward Zand before the story pushes them into the world of darkness. The name outlived the game that coined it. It's resurfaced in mobile remasters, in crossover fighting games, and in Final Fantasy XIV's own Crystal Tower raid series, which reuses the same bosses under the same name. The actual source is Final Fantasy III, first released for Japan's family computer in 1990, more than 2 decades before the Final Fantasy XIV raid. A capital burned down in the last entry on this list and turned one hero's grief into a battlefield. Here the wound scales passed a single home. Nothing in the games confirms this was the plan, but the pattern holds. The name keeps resurfacing across later Final Fantasy titles, an identity that keeps outgrowing the single adventure that first built it. A symbol that outlives its first story can still gain power from one player's last stand, and the next fortress measures that power across an entire cast. Kefka's Tower. Kefka has already won the game, and by the finale, he's ruling from a tower built out of the wreckage of the world he tore apart. Debris of civilization crushed together and stacked into a spire, with him sitting on top like a landlord inspecting the damage he caused personally, clipboard in hand, checking off every ruined district like a job well done. No lease required. That height gives Kefka a trigger. From the top, he runs something called the Light of Judgment, a beam that burns whole towns where people still stand against him as a hobby, no warning shots included. The tower operates as a live weapon with a god working the controls, and every step upward puts you closer to the barrel. Getting there is the real gauntlet, and the game refuses to let you climb as one tidy 4-person unit, the same trick it already pulled once in the Phoenix Cave. You can bring up to 12 characters into the tower and split them into 3 separate parties, working through 3 separate paths and switching between the groups as you go. The tower forces you to prepare 3 parties from the available cast, not just one favorite team, because each party has to survive its own encounters and bosses. This tower flips the test onto the player. It checks whether you actually built more than one functional party or just carried a favorite through the entire adventure and hoped nobody noticed. The 3 groups claw up separately, then meet again for the final sequence where the man who broke the world is waiting for the party. He does. You do. The tower falls the same way the world did, in pieces, except this time the pieces are his. When a dungeon measures how well you prepared multiple parties, this ruin can reveal why the journey itself keeps circling back. The Chaos Shrine. The final dungeon in Final Fantasy is a location the party already cleared, 4 crystals and 1 princess ago. Garland shows up in the opening hour as a fallen knight guarding Princess Sarah inside the Chaos Shrine, and the fight feels like a tutorial boss with a grudge. The party beats him, rescues Sarah, and moves on to the actual game. 4 crystals, 4 elemental fiends, a world map full of side quests. At first, the game presents that fight as a straightforward rescue encounter, before the ending reveals what it was building toward. Then the crystals are restored, and the shrine opens a warp that sends the party 2,000 years into the past, where the same shrine becomes the final dungeon. Kefka's Tower asked players to justify keeping every hero alive for one last climb. The Chaos Shrine asks something stranger. It asks the player to recognize a room they already walked through, now seen 2,000 years in the past, holding the four fiends and chaos in its depths. Chaos is Garland, sent 2,000 years into the past after his defeat. There, he sends the fiends into the future, creating the loop that leads back to that defeat. The knight from Hour 1 and the final boss share one body, looped through his own death until it stopped being an ending and became an engine. Older localizations called the place the Temple of Fiends or the Temple of Chaos. Later English releases and references use the name Chaos Shrine, though players who started with those earlier versions may still know it by those older names. Strip away the crystals, the airship, the world map, and every dungeon this list has ranked, and one shape remains. A hero walks into a shrine, beats a knight, and spends the rest of the game making sure that knight had a reason to exist. The Chaos Shrine sits at both ends of the adventure at once, the opening wound and the final chamber, holding the entire game inside a single loop it never has to leave. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.